Hey everybody, so today's video is going to be quite unlike anything I've ever made. Recently, in response to the killing of George Floyd, the Department of Justice investigated the Minneapolis Police Department and released an 89-page report on their findings. They went through hours of body cam footage, looked through police reports, conducted interviews, went on ride-alongs, reviewed complaints, and did statistical analysis on the MPD's actions between 2016 and 2022. The report is one of the most galling, horrifying things I have ever read. What you're about to see is not a hot take. I don't have any fancy opinions or original thoughts. I just want this information to be widely known, so I'm going to summarize it for you in some detail. One note before we get into it, Minneapolis is a fairly small city. It has a little more than 400,000 people, and its police force has 571 officers. I begin with this bit of information because I believe it is vitally important. As we're about to see, the MPD has engaged in a pattern of reckless and criminal behavior. I will be talking about statistics in this video, but I will also talk about many specific instances of that behavior, and when I do, I want you to remember that this system is not big. It does not have thousands of people. It is about the size of an average public school. Every repulsive thing that I'm going to describe was done by one of 571 people. And with that, let's get into it. Part 1. Excessive Force. The DOJ found that the Minneapolis Police Department had a pattern of using unlawfully excessive force. In 75% of cases where force was used by an officer, the victim did not have a weapon and was not violent. That in many cases, officers used force when it was absolutely uncalled for. An MPD officer responded to a call that an unarmed black man was trying to light fires in a parking garage. Presumably, he was doing this because he was cold, but the report doesn't say. The officer was familiar with this man who had been doing this for the last few days, and he seemed annoyed that he was being called to deal with this same guy again. By the time the officer reached the man, he was standing across the street from the garage. I quote here, "The officer shook his pepper spray canister as he approached the man, saying, 'Hands where I can see them, sit on the ground. I'm gonna mace ya.'" The pepper spray here was not necessary to defend against this homeless man. There is no sense of threat here. The situation was entirely under control. Rather, the spray was quite obviously used as an extra-legal punishment. You made me come out here. You broke the same law multiple times. Now you get your punishment. I begin with this story of a cop using obviously criminally excessive force against a non-violent perpetrator of a minor offense because it seems to me emblematic of the culture of the MPD. It is a culture that seems to revolve around a sadistic and deranged power fantasy, the belief that those people enacting or suspected of enacting crimes are subhuman and that any reaction to them, no matter how violent, is justified. We see the MPD enacting these kinds of illegal punishments over and over again in the DOJ report. A white man was experiencing a mental health crisis, and the officers handcuffed him to a stretcher. While there, the man spat at the officer, and the cop slapped and punched him in the face. After the man was in the hospital, the officer's body cam recorded him saying, "I'm really proud of myself. I only hit him twice." That is to say, my entirely unnecessary use of force against a restrained man who posed no threat was a good day for me. I'm really impressed with myself for my own incredible restraint. Some MPD officers responded to a fight in progress and confronted a man sitting on a bench. The guy's nose was bleeding and one officer tried to examine it, but the guy said, "Don't touch me." That was his right. He wasn't posing a threat to the cop, and their prying at his nose wasn't necessary for any reason. But to the officers, this wasn't acceptable. One grabbed him by the wrist and pinned his face to the bench. The other pulled his ear and pushed him down. After they handcuffed him, the man asked, "Why are you doing this to me?" And the cop responded, "We didn't want it to go this way. We wanted to go a different way, but you didn't want to cooperate." Of all the examples of the MPD acting like deranged freaks, one jumps out to me more than most. A woman jaywalked and a cop exited his car and followed her. Here, I'll just quote from the document. The officer grabbed her arms from behind and stated, "Stop, you're under arrest." She turned toward him and said, "Huh?" The officer replied, "You play stupid games, you get stupid prizes," as he pulled her arms behind her back. She said, "What do you mean?" while turning toward him. The officer then yelled, "Stop," and threw her down, slamming her face into the curb. The officer would go on to lie about this event, claiming that the woman was speeding up, evading arrest, even as the body cam footage showed no such thing. Think for a second about what the cop said here. Play stupid games, get stupid prizes. It's as though he believes he's in a movie, dishing out tough but necessary street justice, telling people his little one-liners. Looking at the abject abuse of power, you can't help but ask, which stupid game did the woman play? Crossing the street when the light was red? The MPD has a pattern of failing to de-escalate situations. It seems oftentimes that they are actively attempting to make confrontations with the public as needlessly violent as possible. A man broke a fence on a public sidewalk, and when the police showed up, he was compliant with their orders. At one point, though, the man turned around to ask the cops if they were in fact police officers. The officer lost control of the man's handcuffed wrists, and chaos ensued. Quote, "The officer continued to shout at the man to put his hands behind his back. The officer then punched the man several times in the face before grabbing his neck. The man repeatedly pleaded for the officer to stop as the two rolled around in a struggle. The other officer drive-stunned him with a taser 8 times for a total of 13.87 seconds, pausing between the 7th and 8th cycle to punch the man in the face." This is a failure of policing at every possible level. For one, the officers hardly spoke to the man at the beginning. They never stopped to figure out if a real crime was being committed. They never asked questions of the man or tried to figure out what was going on. More importantly, perhaps, even after violence ensued, the officers did not break from that violence for a substantial enough time to allow the man to comply with their orders. There is no reason for an officer to stun someone 8 separate times between punches because there was no time in that process to see if that degree of force was remotely necessary. And obviously, it wasn't necessary. A similar situation occurred when an MPD officer pulled over an unarmed black woman for performing an illegal U-turn. The woman got out of her car and approached the officers, yelling at them. The sergeant told her to get back in the car, but a language barrier made the communication difficult. The officer then told the woman to, quote, "Get over here," and without warning fired his taser at her for 5 seconds. After this, he pushed her to the ground and tased her again for 7 seconds as she yelled, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Why did the officer do this? It's entirely unclear. The woman was again unarmed and posed no immediate threat. It was simply an arbitrary and unnecessary show of force. Another taser example, why not? Officers performed a routine traffic stop on a car with a broken taillight. They wanted a teenage black boy to get out of the car because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The kid requested over 20 times that the officers call a supervisor to the scene, but instead of doing that, the cops took out their tasers and the boy yelled, "I'm scared, I'm scared." This kid was being menaced because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and rather than talking to him like a person, they, within moments, threatened him with a painful and terrifying shock. One of the most prominent places MPD officers fail to de-escalate situations is with mentally unwell people. For the record, that police officers, armed men prepared for violence, are so often called to deal with people having mental health episodes is a bad thing. For the vast majority of calls related to people having mental health episodes, the person in question is not armed and is not a threat, and police only make arrests of people having this kind of episode 0.45% of the time. The DOJ suggests that far more of these cases should be handled by primarily mental health crisis workers, and I, of course, agree with that. In any case, the MPD are often called to deal with these things, and they once again rise to the occasion. In one case, a man was sitting on a bench wearing pajama bottoms but no shirt or shoes. He had unmedicated bipolar disorder and his neighbors were concerned. The man, though agitated and loud, was compliant with officers. At one point in the interaction, though, as the man was sitting quietly, the officers fired a taser at him with no warning and handcuffed him. In another case, a concerned mother called 911 because her adult black daughter who had bipolar disorder was lying in the road. Officers responded to the call and confronted the woman, who had, by this time, gotten up and was walking through the park calmly. One officer grabbed her arm and the woman didn't like that, yelling, "I didn't do nothing illegal. I'm walking through the park like y'all walking through the park." At this point, a second officer grabbed her and put her in a neck restraint, as her mother, no doubt regretting her incorrect belief that someone helpful would show up for her daughter's emergency, said, "Don't choke her like that." A Latino man was walking through the park, using a branch as a walking stick. An officer responded to a report of this walking man. He pulled up his car and asked him where he was going. The man seemed disoriented. He ignored the officer, but nonetheless was calm. The officer then exited his car, put the man in a neck restraint, and pinned the man to the pavement for 13 minutes. He later had to be intubated because of these absolutely needless injuries, because the police of Minneapolis cannot seem to interact with the public without escalating the situation beyond all rationality and humanity. The problems don't end with the confrontations, though, the beatings and the tasings and the threats, because when people are in the clutches of the MPD, when they have been thoroughly restrained, cops have a habit of treating them terribly. The most obvious example of this is George Floyd, whose medical needs were completely ignored by the MPD, but there are far more examples of this kind of behavior. In one case, the police were transporting a diabetic woman to jail. She asked to see a doctor because she couldn't see straight and they ignored her. When they arrived at the jail, the handcuffed woman was limp. An officer took her from the car and laid her on the concrete. As she moaned for help, an officer leaned down and said, "Just so we're clear, since you're playing games, I'm gonna add another charge for obstruct, okay? So you're gonna spend more time in the clink, okay?" When a nurse inspected the woman later on, one of the officers said he didn't know if the woman had diabetes, but joked that, quote, "She's got tons of needles, I know that." The fundamental apathy and derision the MPD has for people in their custody can be seen over and over again. At times, they'll handcuff people, throw them in their squad cars, and slam the door on their heads or legs. They'll leave them unbuckled in car seats so they slide around. In one 2018 case, they hogtied a compliant black man even though their policy prohibited it. Perhaps most troublingly, the MPD has a habit of ignoring the medical needs of the people whose necks they restrain. The DOJ reports that there were numerous times when people said they could not breathe, and the officer responded, "You can breathe, you're talking right now." I'd actually like to finish out this section by talking a bit more about neck restraints, because their use, I think, represents the MPD at its most belligerent. Neck restraints are deadly force. They inhibit blood or airflow, which poses a significant risk of injury or death. And the Minneapolis police have a history of using them when they are completely unnecessary. Between 2016 and 2022, the MPD used 198 neck restraints, and in 44 of those encounters, they did not even make an arrest. Sit with that baffling statistic for a moment. I'm not saying here that in the other 154 cases, the police's neck restraints are reasonable. The DOJ makes very clear that most of them were not reasonable. But in almost a quarter of these cases, the police performed a potentially lethal action on someone who they did not even go on to arrest, who presumably committed no crime at all. A Latino man was kicking his car and saying that he was going to kill somebody. When the police came, he was agitated, yelled that he was the creator, and threatened to fuck the officer up, but he posed no immediate threat. Standing with his arms outstretched, one holding a beer, the other hand empty, an officer crept up behind the man and squeezed his neck until he was unconscious. To emphasize the obvious, it is not now, nor was it ever legal, to use an unconscious neck restraint on a man whose resistance was entirely passive. In another case, a mother called the police on her teenage son because he'd allegedly assaulted her. When they came, the 14-year-old black boy was lying on the bedroom floor playing with his phone. Officers moved to arrest him, but he moved away, and one officer struck him in the head multiple times with a flashlight and pinned him to the wall. Then, the cop kneeled on the boy's back or neck for 15 minutes as his mother yelled, "Please do not kill my son. He's only 14. You've already got him in the handcuffs. Please take your knee off my son." For the record, that officer was Derek Chauvin, who would continue acting as a police officer and, 3 years later, kill George Floyd in much the same way. In 2020, in the wake of Floyd's death, the MPD banned neck restraints, and while this is, of course, a positive step, the response police officers had to the policy change is illuminating. Many felt the choice to ban potentially lethal action was politically motivated, an overcorrection that would lead to more force. As one officer put it, if you can't touch the head or neck, the result is you punch them. A sentence that confuses me for 2 reasons. First, punching someone is preferable to restricting their blood and airflow. Second, the MPD already punches people a fair amount. While neck restraints have gone down since the ban, officers still sometimes use them illegally. In one case, an MPD officer restrained the neck of a protester who threw a punch. In another case, an officer restrained the neck of a black man to stop him from running away with some sneakers. Part 2. Freedom of speech. As you might imagine, the behavior of the Minneapolis police tends to make people pretty mad. Especially in the wake of George Floyd, folks like to protest the MPD. Journalists cover them a lot. People say mean things to police officers. I know what you're thinking. Sure, these police officers seem kind of iffy, but they would never go against the First Amendment. Surely this section will be about the one really dope thing about the police. No, unfortunately not. In the shock of a century, the MPD is not good about honoring people's freedom of speech. I don't know why I wrote this extremely dumb joke lead-in paragraph for this section. I think it's just because the Minneapolis police are almost comically pathetic about this issue. They show time and time again an outright derision for basic freedom and a willingness to bully people who act against their wishes. The MPD has a pattern of inflicting violence on peaceful protesters with no discernible justification. In one case, officers told a protester to move back, which she did. Then, one of them started pushing her, and when she said, "Don't fucking push me, asshole," he pushed her harder, knocking her onto the pavement and causing traumatic brain injury. The police like to do this shoving thing. There are 2 other cases of it at this same protest. In one, officers ran behind a protester and forcefully shoved him in the back. In the other, they shoved a guy who was recording the police. The MPD isn't always so confrontational, though. They also have various generally non-lethal projectiles at their disposal, and they regularly use them against peaceful protesters. For example, one officer shot rubber bullets at a distant crowd. Visibility was low, and he had no clear target. He was just kind of shooting and letting fate decide. Nearby, a journalist was hit by a rubber bullet and lost her eye. The Minneapolis police seem to revel in this ability to commit indiscriminate violence. During the George Floyd protests, one officer encouraged another to throw a flash grenade at a crowd of protesters, and the officer responded, "You mean throw one? I'll just fucking throw it. They'll scatter real quick." Later on, the officers congratulated one another for hitting fleeing protesters. "You hit him. Nice." And this sort of attitude pervades the force. In one case, a sergeant told an officer, "I'll give you a pack of beer if you hit the protesters with a 40mm. In another, a different sergeant encouraged officers to shoot rubber bullets, quote, "in the junk." The MPD isn't just opposed to protesters, though, but also to the people who record and cover their actions. The police confronted a journalist who was filming. He shouted that he was press, and he held his badge up, and the police pushed his head into the pavement. When he continued to yell that he was press, a cop pepper sprayed him directly in the face and walked away. In another case, an officer pepper sprayed a man for recording them. When he refused to leave, they threw his phone off a bridge. While there are more cases I could name, I'll end this section with what I see as the embodiment of the MPD's relationship to freedom of speech. The cops responded to a disturbance call about a college party. There, a 19-year-old yelled, "Fuck the police." One officer grabbed him, and the kid correctly affirmed his right to say that, but the cops disagreed. "No," an officer said, "you can't." Another officer put the teenager in a neck restraint, and he screamed that he couldn't breathe. Later on, as the kid was in the back of a cop car, one officer said, "Hopefully you can tell your friends when you say 'fuck the police.' Now you understand that's actually not legal unless you're in a riot or a display of protest." Part of me can't help but wonder what motivated a sentence like that. Was this officer straightforwardly lying, saying people weren't allowed to yell "fuck the police" because he wanted to bully a kid? Or did he believe it? Are the Minneapolis police so brainwashed, so authoritarian, that they truly think it's against the law to be mean to them? Part 3. Racism. Minneapolis is a city of extreme racial inequality. Black people make, on average, 44% as much as white people do. 25% of the black population owns houses, whereas 77% of the white population does. Native Americans, and I use that term here because it's what's used by the DOJ, are a similarly marginalized population. They too make about 44% as much as white people do, and are 18 times more likely to be homeless than white people are. These inequalities cannot merely be solved by making the police better or by abolishing them. They must be tackled in their own right, combated with resources and policy changes designed to rectify the outcomes of historical and current-day injustice. That said, the Minneapolis Police Department is part of the problem. They are very racist, and that, obviously, is what I'm going to talk about today. The police perform far more traffic and pedestrian stops on black and Native American people than they do on white people. They stop black people 6.5 times more and Native Americans 7.9 times more. Even more troubling, the MPD stops black people and Native Americans with no arrest or citation extremely often, around 6 times more often. That is to say, the police of Minneapolis have a habit of stopping these people for no reason at all. You may think this point about stops is somehow minor. It's not flashy in the way excessive force violations are, but it is extremely important. For one, it speaks to a pattern of routine victimization and prejudice. The MPD regularly perform what are known as pretext stops for minor violations that are actually done so as to investigate supposedly suspicious activity. And the fact that the MPD does this kind of stop, and usually does so on black and Native American people, represents a culture that sees these people of color as inherently guilty and suspicious. What's more, every stop that the police perform is an opportunity to enact violence, to menace someone, to let things get out of control. To make things worse, the MPD are far more likely to search and use force against black people and Native Americans. The cops use chokeholds against these people around 10 times more than they did against white people. Even black and Native American kids are more likely to be victims of force. Compared to white adults, POC youth are around 180% more likely to have bodily force used against them, and around 500% more likely to have guns unholstered or pointed at them. I'll emphasize, that comparison is to white adults. The rate at which white kids have force used against them is far, far lower. A black teenager allegedly took a $5 burrito without paying. A plainclothes officer then held him at gunpoint. When asked if he was really a cop, he said, "Really? How many white people in the city of Minneapolis have you run up against with a gun?" He also reportedly said, if he doesn't steal today, he will steal tomorrow. According to an arbitrator assigned to review discipline, an officer approached a car and ordered the teen driving it to get out, threatening, "If you fuck with me, I'm gonna break your legs before you get a chance to run." The teen then asked why he was being arrested, and the cop said, "Because I feel like arresting you." And when the kid called him racist, he responded, "Yep, and I'm proud of it." He added, "Do you remember what happened in Black Hawk Down when we killed a bunch of you folk? I'm proud of that. We didn't finish the job over there. If we had, you guys wouldn't be over here right now." In one case that I find particularly illustrative, a black woman called up the MPD about a guy putting up flyers threatening Black Lives Matter activists. The cop who answered said Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization and that, quote, "We are going to make sure you and all the Black Lives Matter supporters are wiped off the face of the earth." Here, we can see that the Minneapolis police are not merely racist incidentally, they are, in some cases, political activists devoted to that cause, devoted to opposing racial progress. The MPD has never reported racial demographic information enough. From 2017 to 2020, they failed to record cases of the people they stopped 30% of the time. But after the death of George Floyd, after concerns about the MPD's racism became national news, the problem became even worse. They didn't report people's races in 65% of stops. The MPD knew they had a problem, knew that they were racist, and their response was to hide that information as much as humanly possible. Part 4. Accountability. While I think it's important to end this video with a discussion of accountability, it's a difficult section to write, and that's for the simple reason that the list of things the Minneapolis police did wrong and the list of times they failed to account for those things is essentially an identical list. While there are extremely rare exceptions, a general rule underpinning the MPD is that it does not do anything about how much it sucks. Take the MPD officer who threw a jaywalking woman to the ground as he said, "Play stupid games, get stupid prizes." Instead of dealing with this naked use of excessive and cruel force, the MPD lied about it, claimed the woman was resisting the officer and speeding up, even though none of this is caught on body cam footage. The woman's complaint was dismissed, and the officer was recommended for non-disciplinary coaching. Take the officer who pushed a peaceful protester to the ground, causing traumatic brain injury. He claims that he gave her a slight push, that she was advancing toward the cops, and that she refused to comply with their orders. These claims were corroborated by other police officers, and the supervisor who reviewed the incident said this account matched the body cam footage, even as it did nothing of the sort. That officer is still on the force. Take the MPD officer who responded to a woman's complaint of some threatening signs by saying that Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization and that they'd wipe her and all BLM supporters off the face of the earth. That woman filed a complaint, but it went nowhere, just like the other 9 complaints that officer received. That cop still works for the MPD. Take a police officer who responded to a home security system false alarm. He scaled a 6-foot fence, went into the backyard, and shot 2 dogs. In the body cam footage, these dogs were doing nothing wrong. One walked toward the officer wagging his tail, and the other approached in a non-threatening manner. But the officer lied, and the supervisor who invested the incident lied for him, claiming that the dogs were growling and running toward the officers threateningly. In the end, the city paid $150,000 to settle the ensuing lawsuit, but the cop who shot 2 dogs for no reason went on to non-disciplinary training. The dogs lived, by the way. They're living dogs. Consider the case of a police officer who, in 2014, punched a man in the face multiple times with a closed fist even as he was handcuffed behind his back. There was no investigation of this behavior, no one even looked at the surveillance footage of the incident, and the cop went on to use unreasonable force many times during his career. In one case, that same officer kicked a man in the face after he was on his hands and knees, causing a traumatic brain injury. Only after this case, after 68 uses of force and 8 separate investigations spanning multiple years, was this cop finally convicted of assault. A different cop, an unrelated cop, had a career where he choked an 18-year-old developmentally disabled student, punched a woman in the face, knocking her unconscious, and beat a man unconscious outside a bar. While the city paid out multiple settlements related to these actions, the cop remained on the force for 12 years. They paid him to do this shit. I could keep going and going and going and going here. I promise there is no end to the cases where cops did horrible things with no repercussions, but here, let's move on to the bigger picture. Because of all the problems with the MPD, its bureaucracy is one of the most troubling. Every level of the system works to protect the police, just as the police protect each other. Let me quote here my favorite bit of writing from this entire DOJ report. Instead of a clear, straightforward accountability system, MPD's system is an opaque maze with multiple dead ends where meritorious complaints are dismissed without investigation and often for no discernible reason. Significant allegations and complaints are mischaracterized or ignored. Officers who commit serious misconduct are diverted to coaching or retraining, and sometimes the coaching or retraining never happens. If MPD does investigate a complaint, obvious misconduct is often overlooked or excused. By the end, the investigation has often taken so long that the complaint becomes stale, leaving problematic officers to continue committing misconduct for years. There is no accountability. There is no justice. The MPD's most primary weapon is systemic failure. I'll end this video on one note. In all its cases of brutality and excessive force, there was only one time in the last 6 years where officers were ever investigated for not holding one another accountable, for not stopping the use of unreasonable force. And that is the case of the officers who failed to intervene when Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. The MPD is a criminal organization, and the only way they can be brought to justice is if we bring them to justice. So that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. It's definitely different from other things I make, but I think it's important, and important in a way that quite literally none of my videos ever have been. If you did like it, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and maybe sign up for Nebula if you like. I have a bonus video out this month, which is surprisingly long, about a very bad Blair White video. Really just a shockingly bad Blair White video, and I talk about it for a while. I don't necessarily love doing this right now because of the nature of the material, but I didn't do it last month, so now it's time for my Patreon question of the video. John Jackson asks, what is your opinion on the most controversial topic of our time, banana-flavored things? Do they actually taste like banana? And follow-up question, do you like them? No. Repulsive. Disgusting kind of treat. Laffy Taffy and Runts are the two candies that I'm thinking of right now that are have a banana flavor. It's not really a modern thing. It feels very passé. It feels very old school in the candy making community. You're not going to see like a Skittle that's banana flavored. They're not going to pop out with a new banana flavored Starburst. It's of the past. It's old. It's obsolete. Nobody cares anymore. Banana flavor tastes bad. And that's my opinion. For the record, I have no problem with anybody who wants to stream this video. It's completely fine by me. I think it's best to get it out. You don't have to commentate on it if you don't want to. It's fine to stream it. Just if you want to. I'm not saying do that. I'm just trying to say you have a blanket permission from me to do it. Okay.